Hello, everybody. So my name is Scott Pesner, Cornell class of 1987, and I'm so happy to be here, first of all. So there's reasons why I'm very happy. First of all, I now work for Cornell, yay, which means I can now officially wear red at events. So yay, thank you very much for everyone who made fun of the other color I used to wear at events. And second of all, I still get to be a Cornell volunteer. And I love if you know me, I love being a Cornell volunteer. And I actually am the current chair of the CAAAN Advisory Committee, which is made up of 19 members. We have, which includes 2 young alumni and 1 current student who actually will be here later. But if the CAAAN Advisory Committee could stand, just let me know you're here. Hi, everybody. These are the members. Some will be coming in shortly. So we actually work across all the CAAN groups, and we work with you to take your input and change CAAN policy and work to improve the system, work on training. So if you have any questions and any thoughts, please come see one of us. We're wearing these lovely CAAN pins, and we'll be glad to talk to you. So how many of you were at CALC last year? So what happened, if you were at the town hall meeting, you remember we had the clickers, and Jim Mazza asked the question, where does Cornell rank among alumni giving, among the Ivies? And everyone, the least popular answer that everyone clicked on was actually the correct answer, which is last. We rank last among the Ivies among alumni participation, and that actually affects in some situations, rankings. So we saw this as this reaction, and everyone was really shocked. So we saw this reaction and said, well, let's understand this a little better, why this is and how, what are the rankings and how, we are Cornellians are very competitive. Yes, we say, rankings, shouldn't matter, but we are competitive and our students are looking at the rankings, so we really have to be conscious of it. So back in 2010, which was really, I think, the first official Cornell Alumni Leadership Conference, I think it was in DC, if I'm not mistaken. On Sunday morning, we actually sponsored a panel on understanding university rankings with Rana Glasgal. And we said, you know what, let's bring that panel back and have Rana update it. And we're so glad she agreed to come and do it. Of course, she's a CAAN Advisory Committee member. So without further ado, let me introduce Rana. And Rana is, I'm proud to say, a member of the class of 87, like me. 87's here, I see some 87's here. Yes. Okay, so Rana Glasgal has nearly 20 years of experience in higher education administration. She is currently the Associate Vice Provost for Institutional Research and Decision Support at Northeastern University, facilitating institutional decision-making by providing integrated analysis and research. Prior to holding this position, Rana spent 18 years at Stanford University, most recently as Assistant Vice President for Workforce Analytics, designing and promoting the use of analytics for decision-making in academic human resources. Before Stanford, she was a consultant with Decision Focus Incorporated. Rana just concluded her term as an alumni elected trustee at Cornell. She is currently a member of the Cornell Alumni Advisory Board, a member and former chair of the CAAN Advisory Committee, and a former chair of the Northern California CAAN region. She has served as a director of the Cornell Alumni Federation and a member of the Ways and Means Committee. Rana holds her BS and MEng from Cornell in operations research. Without further ado, here's Rana.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the introduction, Scott. Ooh, that's loud. And when Scott gives you an introduction, you're never quite sure what to expect, but that was just wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really glad to be reprising this particular presentation because when I got out the old one from years ago, I realized how much had changed, and actually quite a bit has changed. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with college rankings. It's a big part of my job, actually, and I wish it were a smaller part of my job. So while I know a lot about it, that's not necessarily by choice. It's just the way things are these days in college admissions. So what we'll do today is go through the kinds of rankings that are out there, domestic, international, or at the end, ways to make your own ranking, find out what you're interested in and make that work for you, instead of letting somebody else decide what your criteria should be. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And I'll also give a quick demo of how to get that data for yourself. And is everybody hearing a bit of an echo? Or is it just me? Okay. Let's start off by talking a little bit about the influence of college rankings. And I will say that this is how some people make their college decisions, but hopefully not everybody. I think maybe somebody could come up with the pizza rankings and you could decide what college to go to based on the quality of the pizza. But that's not how we want to make decisions. And speaking of decisions, I'm wondering how many people out there are at this presentation because they have a high school age son or daughter who's looking at colleges. Anybody looking at colleges right now? Yeah, there's quite a few. And the rest of you are just here because you're a friend of mine and you're being supportive. So thank you very much. So hopefully we'll give you some information to get out of this situation right here and into something a little more conducive to good decision making. So what is the influence of college rankings? So there's something called the Harry Freshman Survey. And HERI stands for the Higher Education Research Institute. They are a group at USC in Southern California. And they do a freshman survey every year, and tons of colleges and universities participate in this. It's kind of de rigueur for college freshmen, especially at selective universities. And so they've been doing this a long time, so they have a really good fix on the college freshman. And so one of the questions that they asked is, what influenced your decision to attend the university you are now attending? And I'm going to show you some results. So the number one answer is that the college has a very good academic reputation. And that is by far the biggest answer. They can check all that apply, but this is the biggest answer. And there's also a difference, if you'll notice, that for all baccalaureate institutions, it was about 65%. But if you're talking about just private universities, that number goes up to 72%. And rankings have a very high component of reputation in them. And so when people are making decisions on academic reputation, that really comes through in rankings. So that has a dual purpose. But there were 19 things that the freshmen could check on this survey as being influential in their decision. Does anybody have a guess where national magazines and rankings in national magazines, I should say, might have come in on the 1 through 19 scale? Any guesses? 2 or 3? Okay. I'm hearing a lot of top 5 kinds of answers. It was actually number 11 out of 19. But again, you'll see that there is nearly a 10-point difference between all baccalaureate institutions and the ones just for private universities. So here we are, Cornellians. We've got Kyle in the back who deals in admissions. For us, in this kind of realm, as a private university, it's actually more important. So that means that these do have some kind of influence. Over a quarter of the students said they were using them. So what rankings are out there? Well, there are quite a few. So there are domestic rankings. You guys have heard of US News and World Report. The Wall Street Journal came out with a new ranking this year. There are the Princeton Review. There's Fisk's Guide to College. That's more of a guidebook than a ranking. There's a lot out there. There's also international rankings. Those are sort of more recent on the scene in terms of popularity and the reach that they have. And I'll talk a little bit more about international rankings in a little while. And then there are also subject-specific rankings. If you're thinking of law school, if you're thinking of business school, there are tons of rankings for those. The best college for psychology or anything like that, there's a lot of rankings that are just about a specific subject. So I think I just mentioned there are both rankings and guidebooks. And since we're into participation here, how many do you think a university typically appears in? A place like Cornell or the place that's my employer, Northeastern University? How many would you guess? Any guesses? 100, I heard? 200. Do I hear 300? So actually, it's somewhere around 90 or 100. So excellent, you're a very informed consumer. Actually, Northeastern, who I work for, we just counted the other day, and it was 120. I would say that was somewhere in the 90s 5 years ago. It's just that they are multiplying. Higher ed is kind of a high-stakes game, and you spend a lot of money on it, you spend a lot of time in it, you want to be well-informed. It's like why we buy consumer reports before we buy a mattress, as we just did. So that's a lot of rankings. So how do you, as a consumer, figure out, what is something that you should be looking for in a ranking? So the idea is that you want to look for a well-explained methodology. If somebody's putting out a ranking and they can't tell you how they got to ordering those colleges, well, then it's not a very good ranking. You should be able to see very transparently all the factors and all the data that are going into this ranking. Otherwise, it's very questionable. It might be sort of a fly-by-night thing. It should have a long track record of stable rankings. As we'll talk about later, US News had some issues in that department when they first started out. You want to see if you're looking at small liberal arts colleges, does this ranking have a lot of other small liberal arts colleges in it? If only the one that your son or daughter is interested in is in there, it's not going to do you much good. So make sure that the peers for the universities that you're interested in are in that ranking. And of course, you want something that provides context. That's related to methodology, but also if they can explain why they're doing it this way, why are they concentrating on academic reputation, or why are they concentrating on research, what's their philosophy, and see if they can provide some context. So if you don't see those kinds of things in a ranking, it may not be worthwhile paying attention to it. So some rankings are just plain silly. This actually exists. This is the college Squirrel rankings. And they haven't been updated in a long time, so that's one reason not to use them. Another reason is it's just plain silly. So Cornell, however, received a 4 out of 5 stars for its squirrel ranking because apparently we treat our squirrels very well at Cornell. and they're very happy, and there's lots of them, and people don't go out and shoot them, I don't know. But we did very well. And my former employer, Stanford University, also got, I believe, 4 out of 5 stars because there were black squirrels on campus. So at least there was a reason for getting 4 stars. So that's like one end of the spectrum that you really can have fun with, but it's not something you would use to make a choice about a college. But I think that when universities see all these rankings, there are a number of different ways that they react. So thinking now not as a consumer, but as a university, there are things that universities say about rankings. So they could be just indignant about it. Oh, we are ranked way lower. We are much better than that. I can't believe they use this horrible methodology, and don't pay attention to them. You could just be indifferent, pun intended there. A lot of the higher ranked colleges are just, they don't talk about them, they don't look at them, you won't find them on their websites. Just ignore the whole thing. Complicit engagement means trying to do better in the rankings, saying, yeah, I want to be in that game, I want to do well in this, and just trying to join in and do better. And then some have actually reacted even more with actually disengaging, saying, take me out of US News and World Report, don't want to be in there. And not too many colleges can get away with that, but some of them can. And there's also the build a better mousetrap type of engagement where you try to either influence the rankings or come up with your own or work with the government to provide information direct to consumers. And what I think that is the most important thing is refocusing the dialogue. It's not about the rankings, it's about your mission as a university and what you feel you do really well. So that's something that we'll talk a little bit about later about what Cornell says about its US News rankings. So let's talk a little bit about domestic rankings, and by that I mean US colleges and universities. There are a lot of new entrants into this market. There's just a lot out there. But US News is the 900-pound gorilla of rankings. Isn't she kind of cute? That's why I put her there. And my husband was looking over my shoulder, and he said, oh, she's pretty cute. So I got some affirmation on that. So US News has been around since 1983. They were really the founder of this game, I'd have to say, the most present and prevalent of the rankings. And at first, the whole score was reputation. They did a survey of academics, presidents, deans of admission, and I think maybe provosts. I'm not sure in the early years if they asked the provost. And they had to rate schools that they were familiar with on a scale of 1 to 5, and that was your whole score. So everybody was ranked based on reputation. Well, that created a bit of an uproar. You know, there's more to colleges than their reputation. And also, reputations move extremely slowly. So, for example, my employer, Northeastern, has changed quite a bit in 20 years. It's a completely different place, but a lot of people wouldn't know that. So they might just be thinking about Northeastern's reputation and abilities from 20 years ago. It's a lagging indicator. So then US News reacted to that by changing its methodology every year. So they were just like scrambling everything up as if it went into one of those bingo ball things, and whoo, Caltech, #1. And that also created a bit of an uproar because it wasn't consistent, and how they were choosing the weightings of their data were highly influencing the rankings. And people were saying, well, US News, you know, put a stake in the ground. What is important to you as a publisher, and what do you think is important to the college going public? So finally, they stabilized, and they do make changes. There definitely are changes from year to year, but they're smaller. So there isn't this big shakeup that they used to have way back when. And in reaction to this, all this movement and the overimportance on rankings, there were a bunch of presidents who said they would no longer fill out the reputational survey. So there's some disengagement there. So there's still reaction to US News in a very unfavorable way, but they're still out there trying. So what they say is that they want to help consumers, and they want them to make an informed decision about college because it is expensive, and it is a big investment and an important choice. And one thing that they've done recently is they put out a whole pretty thick magazine that also goes into trends in higher education and innovation in higher education. So they are trying to provide a little more context around higher ed. So if you do subscribe online or get the printed version, you'll get a little bit more background, and that I think is helpful. And they're also trying to provide transparency in how they do the rankings. And they are very transparent, except for a couple of things that are complete black box and nobody knows how they do it. If you ever want to know more, the guy who runs this part of US News, his name is Bob Morse, and he has a blog that's called Morse Code, because he's such a clever guy. And yeah, if you've ever heard him speak, he is the most dry speaker ever. You could never go at this if you've heard of it. She's like, yeah. He has kind of a monotone, and he just stands behind the podium and talks in a monotone. But he's very serious about this. He's been doing it a long time, and he has taken all the criticism in the world that could be heaped on him, but he's still out there trying. And he does write a blog, so if you find this whole topic interesting, you might get some insights from his blog. So let's talk about the methodology. So this is the methodology, and as you can see on the right is a list of the high-level categories that go into a ranking. So the biggest two, I'd have to jump off the stage to point at it, so I'm not going to do that. But the biggest two are, of course, academic reputation, which I just talked about. And then, to their credit, they have responded to criticism about putting too much weight on student selectivity. That's the inputs. That's the part that Kyle has to deal with. They've put more weight on graduation and retention. So graduation rates are the percentage of a particular cohort that all starts together, like our class of '87. We came in '83 in the fall, and we graduated, hopefully, 4 years later in the spring of '87. This graduation rate is actually a 6-year graduation rate, but it's that percentage of the incoming freshman cohort that graduates within 6 years. And for a place like Cornell, it's very, very high. And the retention part is just freshman to sophomore year. For all the freshmen who started in the fall of '83, how many of them were still back for their sophomore year in the fall of '84? And again, for Cornell, those are really great numbers. Other things are faculty resources. That's the blue part, the 20%. And that's things like the percent of faculty who are full-time, the percent of faculty who have their terminal degree in whatever subject they teach. Typically, it's a PhD, but it might not always. I think Marnie would know that's a Master of Fine Arts if you're teaching in the fine arts. So then you move on to student selectivity, and that used to be a much bigger piece of this pie. But as people rightly pointed out, it's not just about the student body that comes in, it's what happens to them while they're there. So very selective schools were always going to be at the top, because if you're Harvard and you have a 5% admit rate, that's pretty hard to beat. Cornell's admit rate is quite low. What were we at, 12%? 12, 13%. So that's very, very low. But what happened there is that universities were accused of just bringing in any applications from anybody, no matter if they even had a chance of getting in, because it inflates your admit rate. Well, deflates it. You want a smaller number. The other thing about selectivity is yield. And that's the percent of students who, if they're offered admission, actually decide to go to your university. And if you have an early decision program like Cornell, where you're obligated to go, unless there are extenuating circumstances, you're going to have a higher yield rate than places that don't. So there was also criticism about universities using their early decision programs to lock students in. And then we have financial resources, which is about how much money you spend per student, which is always a little perverse to me. Because if you spend more money on your students, then you have to charge more tuition, and then it becomes more expensive. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but regardless, it's still in there. And then you have graduation rate performance, which is that 7.5% on the top. Graduation rate performance is one of those black boxes. They take the characteristics of your incoming class from 6 years ago. What were their SATs? What were their high school GPAs? So the quality of that class. And then they look at your graduation rate and say, well, given the characteristics of that incoming freshman class, we think that X percent should have graduated in 6 years, like 90%. But if we actually graduated 92%, then we're +2. We're out ahead of the game. But that algorithm that they use to determine what that 90% is, nobody knows. Closely guarded secret. They also look at, not in that category, I think, it's in faculty resources, I think, the class sizes. And we all remember at Cornell, we took a few big classes. I mean, who took wines? I did. Psych 101, yeah. But weren't they great classes, right? But we got dinged on that because they were very, very large. 50 or more people is all lumped into one category. So they used to give credit for any classes that were 19 and below. So what do colleges do? They set the cap, not at 20, but at 19. Right? So now 19 is this magic number. So they decide to put a little bit more nuance in that, and you have to report class sizes from 2 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, et cetera, up until you get to 50 plus. But they are not telling us how much each category is worth. So there's another black box we haven't figured out yet. And that was a very recent change. That just happened last year. So that's how it works. Simple, right? One thing that's really interesting about the whole rankings and guidebooks universe is that people like me do all the work. So wouldn't you love to be in a business where the colleges and universities do all the work and you just publish it? What a great business. But that's why I sort of have a love-hate relationship with them, because it's so much work. It takes resources to do all this stuff. One of the pieces of pie, the last 5%, is alumni giving. And this is, I think there's a session going on right now about alumni giving. Maybe it's over there or over there. The reason why US News puts it in is because it's a kind of a proxy for how satisfied alumni are with their college experience. And the way it's calculated is that you take the number of alumni of record, undergraduate alumni of record, grad students are not counted, so people you have an actual address for, and then looking at the percentage of those people who actually gave a gift. Now, they do not look at the size of the gift. The amount of money does not matter. So it's really about participation. So we like to say to our very young alumni, give us $1, give us $5, doesn't matter. You'll still count towards this thing, which Scott told us about in his introduction is not as good as other Ivy League peers. It's much better than many other universities, including the one I work for, but it's pretty amazing that it's lower than our peers, because we have, look at this room, an incredible number of very engaged alumni. But I think maybe we just don't make the point enough that it's just about participation. In this case, everyone does get a participation trophy. So our ranking for Cornell, there was a lot of jumping around. There was a lot of jumping around for everybody in the early years of US News. But since then, we've fluctuated between 12th and 15th, and most recently at 14th. And we were tied with the universities you see here. And generally, we're around the same as Northwestern, Brown, Dartmouth, Rice, Johns Hopkins. Actually, they've moved up a little bit, but that's kind of where we are. And I put the ranking for Cal Berkeley at 21st because it just indicates that the methodology is somewhat skewed towards private universities. It's very hard for the publics to move up in the rankings into the top 20. I think Berkeley once hit 20. And that was about it. So that's kind of where we've been. So that begs the question, will we move up? And the answer to that is probably not. Think about the Amazon rankings. So there's a lot of books on Amazon.com, and they rank them in terms of sales. At the bottom of the rankings, you might have a book about blue butterflies in the Midwest and their migration patterns. Right? It's not of general interest to a lot of people. So if I wrote that book, I might have sold 100 copies of it to other like-minded butterfly people. But I'll be really low in the rankings. If I sell another 20 copies, maybe, I'm going to zoom up the rankings. I'm going to be like 20 spots higher overnight because I sold 20 copies of my butterfly book. But if I'm Stephen King and I've sold hundreds of thousands, or 1 million copies of my latest thriller, and I sell 20 more, am I going anywhere? No. I'm still number 2 behind Harry Potter. And that's always the way it's going to be. So you'd have to sell an awful lot to overtake Harry Potter. So that's kind of the way the rankings are. It would require an incredible structural change, an incredible amount of money, a change to our mission. We have a land-grant mission. We would have to punt on that to be able to move up in the rankings. So I've done sensitivity analyses, even when I worked for Stanford. Stanford's always 4th, 5th, and 6th. They happy with that? No. Provost wants to know why we're not as high as Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. So if you do a sensitivity analysis on this, you realize that you really can't move up unless something really dramatic changes, or a lot of things change a little, and they all get you together to maybe move up a spot. So that's why it's so tough at the top of those rankings for us to move around, so we should just be really pleased. Many universities are jealous of our rankings, so that's kind of the way it works. And there was a really interesting paper that I showed to the president of Northeastern, and he got the point. That is that there are neighborhoods in US News, and I'll show you a picture of this. That's the picture. How many engineering geeks like graphics like this? I'm a geek, I like this. Each of those colored bands are a neighborhood in the US News rankings, and the dotted lines are universities that have fallen within those neighborhoods. And what you can see, and again, I don't have a pointer as far as I know. Is this a pointer? No. Is that all those little dashed lines stay within the color band that they're in. It's extremely stable. The little brownish band at the top, that's Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. They have been 1, 2, and 3 since the beginning of time almost. And then there's a set below them that are rankings like 4 through 10-ish, and they haven't moved up and they haven't moved down. The only one that has made a movement between neighborhoods is that darker line that goes from the kind of peach color to the blue. That is the University of Chicago. They somehow made the move, but they have really been the only ones in the top 50 to change neighborhoods. So what does happen is, and you can see this from Cornell, is that there is movement within the neighborhood. all the universities within a neighborhood change street addresses. So maybe you're in the best house in the neighborhood, and then maybe you're in the next best house and the next best house, and then maybe you move back to the best house. But that's all that's been happening for years and years, and that's what this analysis shows. Also, an exception to this is Northeastern, that about 10 or 15 years ago was ranked in the 100s, somewhere between 100 and 150, and is now ranked 40th. That's highly unusual, very, very unusual. That's how much Northeastern has changed. But the reputation ranking is still low because reputation takes a long time to gather. So I hope the takeaway you see from this is that next time you see that Cornell goes from 14th to 15th, you'll just say, oh, that's just noise. It really isn't statistically significant. I should expect that kind of movement. It's going to happen. And you won't see, unless US News makes a huge change to their methodology, which they have been criticized for in the past, so it's unlikely, you won't see Cornell up in the top 10. That's just kind of the way the numbers work out. So that's my US News lecture. So just really briefly, Cornell is proud of where we are and encourages people to move beyond the numbers, come to campus, talk to students, talk to alumni like us. We're all ambassadors for Cornell, and we can go beyond just the numbers, and contact people like Kyle with questions. So that's really where we want people to be. Like maybe you can use the rankings as a general guide, but then go deeper. So let's talk a little bit about international rankings. And these have come on the scene since about 2009, 2010. These are rankings that attempt to rank universities worldwide. So you can imagine what an undertaking that is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of universities. And the big three in international rankings are Times Higher Education. Does anybody know the London Times? They used to produce a higher education supplement. It was like something they slid into your newspaper once a week or once a month, and they started to do a ranking. So it's called the Times Higher Ed rankings. I think they have since left the London Times, but they somehow managed to keep the name. There's QS, Quacquarelli Simons or Simmons, I'm not sure, they're also British. We just call them QS because that's way too long. And they got into the game with Times Higher Ed. They were a single ranking, and then they got divorced, and now there's two of them. Yay, more work for my department. And then Shanghai, university in Shanghai, well, it used to be attached to the university, now it's independent. It's called the Academic Rankings of World Universities, the ARWU. And you'll notice a consistency there. Even in world context, Cornell is way high. The only non-American universities that squeeze into the top 20 or so are Oxford, Cambridge, and sometimes a German university, I think it's Heidelberg, maybe? But largely, it's filled with American universities at the top. These rankings are very research heavy. They measure publications and citations for your faculty, because that's kind of a common ground across the world. Like, you know, foreign students who are going to school in Europe aren't taking the SAT, so you can't use that as a measurement. But you can look at the faculty and what the faculty are doing in research. And so you have to look at what are they publishing? Things that they've published, have they been cited? How much research do they do? So that they tend to be very research heavy. QS puts a little twist on it. They do all that research stuff. But one of their values is that a university should be international in flavor. So they look at the percent of international students at your university and the percent of faculty who are international. So that's their thing. The other twist that QS puts on that is that they do an employer survey. So they ask employers worldwide, well, how do you like the graduates from this university? Are they doing a good job for you or not? So that's a bit of a twist as well. So we do pretty well in those, actually, because of the research enterprise. Cornell has an amazing research enterprise, and also somewhat international. So that's if you just want to, if you're thinking about your son or daughter maybe going to school abroad, those would be a good reference for you. Is anybody thinking about a son or daughter going to school abroad? Not so much. Okay. So let's talk a little bit beyond the rankings. I've been talking a lot about US News and other kinds of rankings, from the sublime to the ridiculous. But how do you go beyond the rankings? And I think that it's important for parents and students to be informed consumers about what's important to them. What's important to you about a college? There are some things that are going to be more qualitative, right? You're going to want a nice campus, or urban, or rural, or a certain size. But I think that if you're just looking at the data, you should think about what matters to you. Are you really interested in graduation rates? Do students graduate when they're supposed to graduate? Is there financial aid? What kind of majors do they offer? Retention is an indicator that people are happy there. The selectivity, is that important to you? And maybe the size of the faculty, the ratio of faculty to students might be important to you. There might be a lot of things that are kind of swimming around in your head, and there's no one ranking that takes all the things that are important to you and puts them in, and the things that aren't important to you and leaves those out. That's pretty hard to find, because everybody's so different. So what I want to recommend is that you think about what's most important to you, and now that you know what it is you don't know, seek out the public data. And there is a lot of public data out there. For example, there's the College Navigator. How many people have heard of the College Navigator? Yeah, there's quite a few, because it's been in the news, for one thing. It was set up by the Obama administration, and we'll see if it survives the Trump administration. I'm not sure. And it has a ton of data, and I'm going to do a quick demo on that in a moment. Yes? Yeah. Yes, it does. So that's a really good point. And during the demo, I'm going to show you how you can find out what majors are offered at a particular college. If you're early in your search and you don't know maybe which colleges offer what your son or daughter is interested in, how you can find out. And then you're talking about subject-specific rankings, right? Yes, so US News has subject-specific rankings at the graduate level. That's typically what happens, is that the subject-specific rankings, like, and hotel school I don't think has any rankings, but business does. You want to study artificial intelligence or computer science, then there are rankings for that, but they're all reputational. So that's all it's going to tell you. So you have to supplement that with other kinds of things. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, especially for Cornell, that has so many majors sort of outside of the mainstream, that a lot of students don't hear about them until they get to Cornell and then they transfer, because they didn't know that Cornell was great in ornithology, because there's nowhere to really find that out. There are no rankings for ornithology schools. Imagine that. So the rankings in the subject areas do tend to be very mainstream. It's not financially viable for a company to put effort into ranking something where there's only about 100 students a year who are studying it. So it's really an economic decision by the rankings and guidebooks to zero in on the more popular things like computer science or various kinds of engineering. So it's always very mainstream. So it's a little difficult, I agree with you, for students to find out something that really hits them as a passion that might be a little off the beaten track. But hopefully I can show you something in College Navigator that will help with that. Yes, hi, class of '87. Oh, okay. I'm actually almost done, so we will answer your question soon. Each college has a common data set, so just search for the college name and a common data set. And the idea behind the common data set is just like what it sounds. Everybody answers the same questions with the same definitions. And publishers often use the university's common data set to create their guidebook or create their rankings without us even knowing about it. They just come, get the data, and do their thing. So if you want to get data that's similar across all universities, search for a common data set. There's also a lot of public fact books out there. Some private universities keep them behind a sign-in, so only faculty, staff, and students can look at them. But a lot of them are public, and you can look at their fact books and see how they've changed over time and what their percent of minority students is, or things like that. There's a lot of data out there just on a university's website. There's something called IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. You can forget I ever said that. It's just IPEDS. And this comes from the government. It comes from the Department of Education. We have a series of statistical surveys we have to fill out every year for the government to be eligible for financial aid from the government. So this is a huge amount of data. Every university in the country pretty much collects this stuff. So there's a ton of data. But it's just not as accessible as some other things. But it's out there. The College Navigator is built on top of that data, and it provides a more user-friendly interface than going into IPEDS directly by yourself. It's available. It's all public. But you might not want to tread down that trail unless you're really a good data person. UCAN is the University and College Accountability Network. This was built during the Margaret Spellings era. Anybody remember Margaret Spellings? It seems like a long time ago now. When she was Secretary of Education, she was big into accountability. And so this was built by private universities. They created UCAN so that you could see in graphical, colorful form the same things for every university. And she pictured people printing them out, putting them on the dining room table, and comparing schools right next to each other. So you can do that. It's also online, of course, with a lot, the data is richer online because it has links to the various pieces of the college's website. VSA is pretty much the same thing, but for publics. So it's the Voluntary System of Accountability. VSA came out first, and then UCAN followed soon after that. Very good sources of information. And SAM, the Student Achievement Measure, is for colleges and universities that tend to serve a more migrating population, that students come in and they take 2 years at University of Wisconsin, and then they finish up at the University of Michigan. So University of Wisconsin's graduation rate doesn't look that great because a lot of people have transferred, but they still finished. So the University of Wisconsin contributed to that person's education for 2 years. So what SAM does is allows you to see the college's graduation rate, say 60%, and then another 30% went somewhere else and graduated. So it gives you a fuller picture than some other kinds of data. So that's one way that you can go ahead and get some really good information. And what I wanted to show you, put that over there, is how you might do that. So I brought up the College Navigator. So that's what it looks like. And you can thank your government for this. And you can type the name of a school. Hey, how about we look at Cornell? And, well, that's weird. Here's Cornell University. So I click on that, and it gives me this really big profile about Cornell. So here's where, to the question in the back, we wanted to look at more information about the school. Does this have it? Enrollment. So it has programs and majors, and so you can expand that, and you can see what kinds of majors Cornell has. So it's a gigantic list. So, if you put up another school, it might not be quite this long. And you can see the enrollment, the degrees that were granted in each program. So you can see, I see that in viticulture, I only had 4 bachelor's students. But hey, they have viticulture. Isn't that amazing? So that's a great way to get information on programs and majors available. So put whatever school you're interested in there in the search box, and it'll pop up. The other thing you can do is say, I want to add this to my favorites. So I'm going to say, OK, Cornell, you're my favorite. And then you're looking at some other schools. Let's put in my employer, Northeastern. And if I do that, I'm going to get a lot of Northeasterns. And so I have to pick out this Northeastern University. I'm going to say, well, add that to my favorites. So now, when I go up here, I can say, well, check all of these, because I want to compare them side by side. I'm not sure I actually did. There we go. And so here's Cornell in one column, and here's Northeastern in another column. So let's say you want to look at admissions. You can compare right there, side by side, the admission statistics. I know you guys in the back probably can't see this, but it'll tell you what the admissions rate is. So as Kyle said, 14% admitted. The data is usually a year or two old, so it's not really, really current. Northeastern admits 29% of its applicants. So you can see a difference right there. And then the yield is also very different. Cornell gets 52% of the students it admits to actually attend, which is a really great number. Northeastern, yeah, we're still struggling a little bit. I think it went up to 22% last year. And then you can look at the SAT scores and ACT scores, and they're all right next to each other. We could look at retention and graduation rates right next to each other. So you get the idea. As many colleges as you want to compare side by side, there's just a ton of data here. So if you want to get out of the rankings rat race, just go to the College Navigator or CAAAN, and you'll get unbiased information that comes directly from the colleges and universities without somebody scrubbing it or telling you what's important to you and your family. So that's where I think that people don't realize that they don't have to be so beholden to the commercialized rankings and guidebooks that are out there. Okay, so now we can have questions, and I think I have a couple of mics here. It's not that big a room, but it still can be hard to hear. So maybe we should start with Liz, since she had a question before.
So my question is, does anybody look at ratio of classes taught by professors versus TAs? Because to me, that's something that is, I know most of my classes at Cornell were taught by professors, and the one class that was taught by TA was my worst class, but it was also physics, and I suck at physics.
I hear
But so I was just wondering if that's something that factors into these rankings.
Not that I'm aware of. There are proxies for that, like the percent of faculty who are full-time, which is supposed to get at the use of adjuncts for teaching, because they're typically part-time. So that you could use that as a proxy for what you're asking for. I think probably they don't go that step further and ask specifically about classes, because that's a kind of a data burden for the colleges. But I haven't seen it. What do we got back there? Somebody have a...
Hi, Lee Hendelman, class of 96, thank you.
Hello.
One of the three things that fundraising people say that you can contribute, one of them is treasure, which is reflected in the giving rate, and the others are time and talent. And you said we have a room full of very engaged and talented people. Does it appear in any of those ranking pies?
No, let's start one. I think Cornell will be number one. No, it actually doesn't. It's all about any ranking that has alumni giving rate. That's all it is. It's about donations. So one thing that you will see in some areas is they have surveys of alumni. Those international rankings I was just talking about, Times Higher Ed has partnered with the Wall Street Journal to create another domestic ranking. And they pride themselves on being very different from the US News rankings. But one of the things that they do is that they email a survey to alumni. And the colleges have nothing to do with this. We don't give them email addresses. They figure out who's going to a particular college and who their alumni are. And this also happens a lot with business schools. So if you're a Johnson School alum, please fill out the survey. So you need a certain response rate to even be ranked. Like the Financial Times, you have to have 20% of your alumni respond from your MBA program, or you're not ranked. So that's an alumni engagement measure. Also, the questions they ask are about outcomes. How did this university help you to achieve your goals? Did it increase your salary after you graduated? Things like that. So alumni can help in those kinds of subtle ways. But the fact that we have this amazing alumni network and 500 plus people here on a weekend, flying in, spending their own money to be here, to volunteer, we don't get a lot of credit for that, which is really unfortunate, because one of the things that I can appreciate being up here is this great audience, that you're here because you want to be here, and you're engaged and you're energized, even though it's after lunch and you're probably all in food coma. That's a really great advertisement for Cornell. Oh, we have Tom saying, class of 87.
So I have the privilege of working at University of Chicago 2006 to 2010. So I'm going to give you the background story of how they jump from
The
number
meteoric rise.
from number 15 to number 9. And 2006, Bob Zimmer returned from Brown to become the new president of the University of Chicago. As a new president, he was dismayed at the number 15 ranking. So he requested, I believe, through his office, an audience with the executive editor of the U.S. News and World Report ranking. Nobody thought he was going to get one. He got one. So he sent a delegation of 6, including the dean of admissions, to Washington. And they sat down and they basically said, what is it that you're looking for that we're not doing right? And again, they were asking questions that they didn't think they were going to get answers from U.S. News and World Report. Lo and behold, the editorial board basically said, okay, we're going to review your data, the data you provide. And they found that in 6 categories, University of Chicago thought by not providing an answer, so for example, they asked for a number of small classes. Well, they said anything that's smaller than 8 students, we call it a seminar, so it's not a class. So they basically don't report those things, right? What people didn't know back in Chicago was when you don't give an answer, U.S. News and World Report assign you an average number. So that takes you down a peg. So essentially, they came home with this wealth of information. They filled out the report dutifully. Basically, what you want to know, we'll give you that number. Without changing anything that they were doing at the university, they went from number 15 to number 9, and they've been in top 10 ever since. The university obviously is improving, but that jump, that meteoric jump, was a result of answering the question correctly.
It's a good story. And I think that the next time I see the University of Chicago's institutional research director, I'll shake her hand. Yeah, I mean, you really have to fill this thing out, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of care. I know it was always reviewed by the communications department, by the enrollment management people. At every school it's a little different, but it gets so much scrutiny. I'm surprised that that was happening, that all those bad numbers or lacking numbers were just happening. It gets a lot of scrutiny. Maybe they had that sort of rank indifference kind of attitude towards it until the new president came in and said, hey, we got to do something about this. I see you have a mic.
So, I didn't hear any discussion about location, urban versus rural, and what a college or university has to offer outside of the university. I retired from an urban university, and one of the things that really attracted students to my school was the fact that we were in the city of Washington, and they spent so much time down on Capitol Hill. You know, the law school, the visiting professors were Supreme Court justices, and it made a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely right, and that's where the whole idea of going beyond the rankings comes in. Nobody is trying to quantify those really amazing facets of a university. Like, what does being in the city of Washington get you? Well, a lot. And I think that that's part of the research that prospective students and their families need to do, because that's an amazing experience. I think Northeastern, where I work now, is a good example of this. If you ever see Northeastern's 4-year graduation rate, it's terrible. It's less than 25%. Because Northeastern's a co-op school, and students are expected to graduate in 5 years because they're going to do 2 or 3 co-ops. They're not even going to be on campus. RIT, another one, where students graduate in 5 years because they're expected to do co-ops. And so you have to go beyond that number and not and understand the context behind some of this stuff, and understand that, oh, you know, I think I'd be okay graduating in 5 years if I did 2 or 3 co-ops and studied abroad, because my experience would be richer and I'd be making money along the way. So it's an excellent example.
So we have time for two questions, but if you will, as these questions are being asked and answered, please work on your questionnaires to help evaluate the session. And we have 2 more questions available.
And cheating is allowed. It's okay. You can crib off your next door neighbor. Where
Hi,
are
I have a mic.
we? Oh, hi.
So a question for you and one for admissions. It seems to me that there have been other schools that mirror the route that University of Chicago has taken, like WashU. And I've seen leaps in my own studying of the rankings over the years. The schools that are in the neighborhood of Cornell, Vanderbilt, whatever else we're tied with, some of them just seem to have made meteoric rises. So I don't know that it's just Chicago. And my question to admissions is, from your presentation, it sounded as if the university is complacent. Sort of, well, we're not going to play this game. We're just going to sit back and we're in a good enough neighborhood. And I guess I'm wondering, do you take into account, in addition to the impact that rankings have on students, the impact they have on your alumni, and the chicken and egg with the giving? I mean, we're lowest in the Ivy League with regard to alumni giving. It's a downer to see your school mired in a spot and lowest in the Ivy League. So to admissions, what do you do about that? And why don't you have the same meeting that University of Chicago had?
Do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that? Well, I will say that the sensitivity analysis that I've done is very telling. For Stanford, it showed that actually, University of Rochester also ran the numbers. It would take millions of dollars, and literally like $100 million in expense to move up, more than a couple of spots. And so that's just not worth it. We'd rather spend our money on innovative new educational paradigms or new labs or whatever it is that we're working on. There is money attached to this. Now, Chicago was leaving things on the table. They weren't filling out the survey correctly. There was some low-hanging fruit. Well, for most schools, all that low-hanging fruit is gone. I went through that at Stanford. I got rid of the low-hanging fruit, and after that, there was just the sensitivity analysis, and we did extensive analysis on this, was just not going to move us unless we hired like several hundred new faculty, which nobody's going to do, because you can't keep your quality and you can't afford it. Even Stanford can't afford it. So I think that that's really where you see the limitations in the methodology and how it all plays out. Kyle, do you want to add to that?
And some of the institutions that you identify that have made great gains in the rankings over the past 10 years or more, part of that was when the selectivity was a much larger factor. And I won't name names, but there were places that were saying, we want to double the number of applications that we receive. We'll give application fee waivers, and we know we'll deny most of them, but we need to inflate our ranking. And so you can manipulate those numbers. You can also manipulate them by spending a lot of money. As Rana said, spending a lot of money on sending out things to schools to generate more interest, to add additional applications. But there are some places that also went from being, in some ways, a regional university to being an international university. And that was, to some extent, we travel with Vanderbilt. To some extent, they've done that. 10 years ago, Vanderbilt was very prominent in the South and not so much beyond that. Now they are certainly a national and an international university. We travel overseas with them as well. So sometimes putting yourself out there and increasing your scope is going to have a greater impact on the rankings in a number of different categories. Well, the reality is that, as Rana mentioned, we, as the university leadership at this point, does not place an emphasis on trying to increase by 1 or 2 spaces, because in some cases, such as that first example I gave, you were doing so at the expense of students. We could go out and get another 20,000 applications next year only to deny the vast majority of those 20,000 students, and is that ethical? So that's my understanding of at least part of the sense around how we treat the rankings. So we,
And Tom and his wife, Rebecca, have been very generous to Cornell, and because he understands as a development officer what that really means to the university. And I will say that one of the reasons why I put in this analysis about the stability of the neighborhoods and the difficulty of moving up is so that alumni will understand that we don't want to make that trade-off. We don't want to move up in the rankings at the expense of things that we really want to do for students, and we certainly don't want to hurt our incoming students in any way.
I actually have two quick ones. So when it comes to the when the college Navigator majors, if you're a double major, does that count for one or for two? Could you be viticulture and plant science, and then that counts as two or one? And then secondly, is there a measure of, let's say, you're tracking how many students graduate in 4 years? What about employed 5 years after that? Those are the things, at least that I hear from students through CAAAN.
Yeah.
That's what they want to know, that they can get
Yeah.
jobs. And that's what could influence where someone goes to school. And part of that is built in with the, if they have a strong alumni, that could help that because you can call on people. And it
Yeah.
seems like there's a hole.
Well, those are good questions. So your first question about the majors, well, what I was showing you on the College Navigator had it listed by degrees, bachelor's, master's, doctorate. So if you got 2 bachelor's degrees, if you were a true double major, you would be listed twice, one under viticulture and one under history, whatever the 2 were. So in case of degrees, they count twice. A lot of times in head counts, if you have a double major, you are put in 1, because head count is a very different thing than degrees granted. So it depends. You have to know what you're looking at, degrees versus head count. Your second question was about, now I've already forgotten. Oh yeah, employability. Oh, so employability is big these days, right? There's gainful employment rules for for-profit colleges and anybody else who passes a certain threshold. There are some rankings that are starting to take employability into account and the percentage of your graduates who are employed at a certain time. So for example, at my alma mater, we're actually, not my employer, I'm not doing this for Cornell in my free time. We are building a dashboard where you can pick the college and major at Northeastern and see what percentage of graduates were employed 6 months after graduation. And we have history on that, so you can see trends. American University has a wonderful website called We Know Success, and that's where you can see that kind of data, who's employed and when. Then you were asking about 5 years out. So particularly Cornell and its Ivy League brethren and other selective colleges and universities do alumni surveys. And they typically survey alumni who are 5 years out and 10 years out, and they do ask them if they're employed or looking for work, because you might be self-employed, you might be staying home with your kids. So that data actually is available on many colleges' websites. Not all of them. Not all small colleges have a big institutional research department like Northeastern or Cornell, and they can't afford to do all this research. But a lot of the bigger schools have this kind of information, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's a really important thing for a lot of students and parents these days. Are we out of time?
Yes, so I'd like to thank Rana. Let's give it up. Woo!